Right. Hi, everybody. So, welcome to today's meeting. Normally, I'll record meetings with Camtasia for YouTube, but we're doing a Teams meeting today. I've invited Mark Brimble, who's down in New Zealand, who's a good friend of mine, and most people in the sort of integration community will know Mark for many years. Mark wrote a really good article a few weeks back about logic app consumption and standard. And if you've seen my videos, you'll know I also did a video on the same topic. And Mark and I have been chatting a bit about this, and we've got some areas where we have very similar opinions on different angles. And then there's a couple of things where we have a slight difference of opinion about certain things. And I think this touches on the really key point where different customers will have different decision points and different requirements that will influence their decision. And I thought it was a really good idea to kind of get Mark to join, have a chat about some of the things he's doing, some of the sort of opportunities and challenges that he's had, and some of his thinking. And we'll just kind of add that to the library of videos. And I think just a discussion between Mark and myself hopefully adds value on top of the videos that we've been putting out recently. So, Mark, welcome to the video. Thank you very much for joining.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, Mike. Nice to catch up again.
Yeah. So Mark's joining us early in the morning as well in New Zealand, so I appreciate him getting up early and joining. Mark, can you tell us a little bit about the projects you're looking at in terms of this consumption standard decision?
Yeah, so we've sort of been through a journey where we've migrated all our integrations of BizTalk server and into Azure, and we got to the point where that was complete, and then we started to think what's next. And really, what we'd done is we'd stuck with consumption logic apps. During that migration, we didn't consider standard, and that was largely because when we started, standard wasn't really wasn't even thought about. But now we're at the point when I wrote my blog article. Really, it was just to put some thoughts down about whether we should move any of our logic apps to standard. So I approached it from the fact that I knew how many consumption logic apps we had in our ecosystem, throughout about 300, and then so I could get the costs of what it's costing us to run at the moment, and then I began to think about, was it worthwhile moving any of these to standard? So I sort of wrote my article. And one of the things that we use heavily in our all our integrations is we use a lot of AS2 Edifact. We probably act as a bit of a van for Bidfoo, and that has some interesting. That led us to some interesting decisions around whether we want to do consumption or standard. So is that enough, Mike, to say where we're at?
Yeah, I think so.
The sort of things we're doing now, we're circling back, and we're improving the security of everything we've done. So my colleague is, at the moment, we're going through and we're putting managed system identity through virtually every connector. We're also this is apart from standard versus consumption. The other thing that we're working on, we're now we're using SFTP on Blob, and we're using that to connect to a lot of on-premise customers. We've completed our sort of proof of concept stage, and now we're right in the middle of migrating everybody off an old on-premise FTP server to the SFTP on blob endpoint. Seems to work very well, and is another useful option, I think, to use instead of a data gateway to get stuff down to on-premise. So that's where we're at. We were sort of busy, but we're now, I suppose, we're in the stage of polishing what we've got, and that's
really
why we're sort of we're thinking about standard versus consumption, and I think I've come to the conclusion that we haven't really got any use cases yet that are would be useful to push it to standard. We might have one. We have a problematic interface which runs in the middle of our night, where we're sending very large catalog files, and we send a lot of them all within a space of time. And it does appear that we're probably getting weird timeouts at certain times. It's sort of costing us about $80 a month in production, so it sort of could fit that model. Anyway, let's move on. That's enough about me.
Yeah, I think there was a really interesting thing you said actually in that, Mark. That I think a lot of people maybe haven't quite cracked, I think, in the cloud yet. So you guys were saying you're sort of making some changes to you did the migration from BizTalk to Azure. You've got your logic apps. You're now doing a lap over, improving them. And you were talking about the managed identity stuff. And I think one of the things that I think of all the cloud projects I've ever done, when you start the project and when you finish the project, if you were doing it again, you would have always done it slightly differently because there's always technology changes. And I think that's the thing for me, especially for BizTalk migration customers, that you need to figure out how you're going to handle that, because a lot of people for BizTalk, you built it in 2006 and then it never really changed. And it's now 2023 and your BizTalk code that you wrote, nearly 20 years ago probably runs exactly the same as it did without really any changes. But now in Logic Apps, and not just Logic Apps, just cloud in general, regardless of what provider you use, you've got, constant updates. So whether it be, we had consumption, now we've got standard, managed identity was a while ago, and there's constant change. How do we keep up with that? And I think that the secret's to try and embrace it into your process and figure out how would I actually, I guess a lot of companies, you need a capital investment project to change anything. But then actually you need to keep up to date with versions of things like .NET and versions of APIs that update and stuff. And if you can adopt some of the newest stuff as part of doing those changes for maintenance, then I think that's how you've probably got to do it.
Yep. So we definitely, when we moved, we set a plan and we didn't deviate from it. We didn't put any of the new stuff in, even though as it came up, we decided we'd just stick to our plan. But interesting you talk about using new things and things changing. My colleague Harris Cristanto is just he's working with the log analytics connector, which I think's in preview at the moment, and we actually used it in quite a extensive way to show something to our customers. And he came to me yesterday and he said, Mark, they've changed the way that and one of the issues with it didn't use managed system identity. It used application identity, something like that. I can't remember. He said to me, they've changed it. They've taken that away and they've put on managed system identity. So you had to run around in production and change everything to use managed system identity.
Yeah.
So you did right. It's things change and you have to move with it. And one of the recent things that we've had to do is we've had to change move the application insights up to the latest version, because it's gonna go. The old classic version is going to disappear in December, and then later on next year we actually have to change the log analytics, because that's changing mid 2024. So I've sort of been discussing with our wider group how on earth we keep track of all these changes. Because it sort of relies on one of us being in the portal at the moment, the way we were, being in the portal and actually seeing a warning saying something's going to go out of expiry.
I think it's an interesting one for logic apps as well, because I think that there's a combination of like design practices, there's a combination of processes that you use in your development team and your IT department to manage these things. And I know one of the approaches we do is try to build small, easy to change interfaces. So when we want to change stuff, it kind of has less of a ripple effect and makes it, the bigger your unit of change, the harder it is and the more dependencies you have. So we try to avoid that. But I think, logic app consumption for me, one of the biggest things that attracts me to it is I can just build a workflow and I don't have to care about what lives underneath the workflow, and it's all kind of done for me. And I think I kind of do wonder with having recently had to upgrade Azure function runtimes in a whole load of function apps, having to do that as part of a logic app deployment, not something I particularly would look forward to having to do. And it's like I want to build the workflow. I don't want to care about the kind of the runtime to a degree. So that is definitely one of the bits. Should we jump through some of these questions and
yes, I think so. Yeah.
So I think your question number one we had was I have 291 consumption logic apps. If I move all these to standard, would this be 291 workflows deployed across many logic apps? Do you want to jump in first with what you're thinking, what your thoughts are on that?
I just put that question in because that was in your video where you talked about the difference in terminology between what's a logic app in consumption and what's one in standard. And I suppose I also was in my article, I was sort of approaching it from a slightly different angle from your article, and I must admit your articles helped me frame my feelings a bit. And what I suppose I was struggling with, I sort of thought, right, well, we've got to shift all of our logic apps from consumption to standard. And so the first thing I began to think about is, how do I put all these 291, if I did migrate them, which I'm not going to, if I did migrate them, would I put them into one host, or would I spread them amongst many hosts? And I suppose, that's what this question's all about. And I also wanted to sort of understand if I've got a host with, say, 50 workflows on it, and I want to add one more, what do I do with the deployments? It sounds from your article, because I haven't used standard logic apps in Angular. What do I do? Do I have to redeploy the whole logic app with the other 50 workflows? Can I just deploy one workflow? So that's probably where the question's leading to.
Yeah. So my thoughts on that are so this is where the big deployment difference between consumption and standards, what is the unit of deployment. So in consumption, I just deploy a workflow, and they may have multiple workflows that talk to each other, but they're each separate kind of things. Now, what we typically do is we'll have a Visual Studio solution that might have say 1 to 5 workflows, that always go as a group, and the chances are it's one interface that we've just broken up into units of work where each logic app kind of does a specific thing, but they would always deploy as a group together. The difference with standard is you've got the app, so just think of it being like a function app. Each workflow is a function, and you've got that deployment unit as the app. Now it depends on a couple of things. So firstly, do you do your deployment in Visual Studio Code or a DevOps pipeline, or do you just write the logic apps directly in the Azure portal? I would hope in most cases, other than a proof of concept, people are using VS Code, so you get the DevOps experience. I think any professional use case using the portal is probably going to run into a lot of challenges. But when you're deploying the app, that's where like I start having questions about how I would sort of like slice up my workflow. So let's say you're 291, I would say putting all of them into a single app isn't going to make sense for a number of reasons. Number one, Microsoft have communicated some constraints. So originally they were talking, I think it was about like 20 workflows being the max for an app, but we were talking to Wagner about what that actually means at Integrate, because a function app can have a lot more functions than that in it. So that was really based around a combination of the triggering and the way it uses storage under the hood. So I think here, if you've got HTTP triggered workflows, it would be different to having something like a service bus polling workflow where it's constantly doing work all the time on the trigger. So that would affect how you would slice and dice them. So I would say putting all 291 into a single logic app wouldn't make sense. You'd also have massive dependencies where that app would depend on everything you integrate with in terms of other systems. Doing it the exact opposite way of having one logic app per workflow wouldn't work either, because you'd end up needing like lots of plans in your case. So you'd have, if you had 291 logic apps, each with one workflow in, they're probably all not going to fit on a single plan. So if you take, think of the app service WS3 plan, it had, I can't remember off the top of my head, I think it's something like 8 cores and 32 gig of RAM or something like that, 16 gig of RAM. There'll only be so many apps you could deploy onto that host before it'll start like limiting. And I think if every app you put on there is going to have to spin up the function's runtime, it's going to have to spin those workflows into memory, and then it might be doing some triggering. So if you imagine you've got 50 apps on there, even when they're not really doing anything, there's probably still a decent sized footprint of usage on the node. And then with the app service plan, as you scale it out, so let's say you scale from 1 to 2 nodes, you just have a second copy of everything on the second node. So scale it out will let you increase your parallel throughput, but it's not going to necessarily let you put more apps on one node. So this is where I think people need to think about how many plans do I need, how many apps will I put my workflows in. And I think what we try to do is, this is why I think we favor the mix of consumption and standard, where workflows that are only like ad hoc usage, so they just happen every couple of hours, once a day. They don't really do that much. They're good consumption ones for us. And then on standard, we let's say we've got one plan and we might put 20 apps on it. We know we're not going to have apps taking up capacity from the node that aren't really doing any work. So we're looking for our apps that are more heavily used and would get better value for money being on that fixed cost than being on the variable cost. I think that's, to me, the biggest architecture art in logic apps now is for standard, which workflows go in what app. So I would still probably group them together based on some functional use case. So like for us, all of our GPS related logic apps workflows will go into a single logic app, and we'll deploy them as a group, because when we want to change one of them, we'd always test the rest of that subsystem together anyway. So it's a good like logical grouping from a functionality, dependency, performance perspective. And I think that they're the things that you probably want to think about. Might be another good good like little decision matrix, a bit like that blog post I did.
Yep.
So the second question we had was about ESC v3 and app service plan. Mark, do you want to
Yep.
jump in with that one?
You touched on that in your video. Yeah. So I was sort of interested in that because I haven't really followed the ASE story very much, because we made a decision very early on not to use ASE. But yeah, I might revisit it.
It was. Do you know this one came from an integrate discussion? So that there's a guy who always comes to integrate called Nick Main, who's he's an old colleague of mine from many years ago. One of my early IT career jobs actually. And we kind of both went off, ended up on a similar project a few years later, and Nick now works for Avanade, and I always bump into it and integrate, and actually he lives up in Scotland, so there's no excuse really for not bumping into him more often, to be honest. But so you just have these chats at the Integrate Summit, which is the sessions are great, but the chats also are just as good, and you find out what other people are doing, and I'd always kind of sort of written off the ESC as being too expensive for a lot of the projects I'd done. I knew where it would fit and what it would do, but it always just never really costed right. And then Nick was telling us about how they've used the V3 on a couple of projects because the cost had changed quite a lot. So I had another look at it after the chat we had, and actually it's really in my opinion it's really comparable with the app service cost. There are some differences though that I think are worth noting. So to me, the biggest difference between them is if you think of an Azure a WS3 plan. So that's the normal Logic app standard plan. If we take the bigger one, because I think the WS1 is really a development plan from the usage when I've used it. I don't think it scales that great for production scenarios, but I think if we were in prod, we'd be looking at a WS3 most likely. I can't remember the exact costs off the top of my head, but I think it's about 800 Canadian dollars a month, give or take. The big thing about the WS3 plan, though, is it's like an elastic premium plan for functions, so you can have it run in one node, but it can burst scale out and then burst scale back in. And that burst scale, I think, is great for some customers who need it. For us, the thing about the cost on the ESC3 makes it a viable alternative. So I was looking at it, and actually there's not really a lot in it cost wise between a WS3 and an equivalent size ESC v3 from what I can see. The biggest benefit though is
I agree with you. I went after I watched your talk. I went and did some costing myself and thought, well, they're about the same.
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing is you can get the savings plans. I think on the ESC v3 that I don't think you can get on the WS plans, which I think actually makes it cheaper. But for me, the biggest functional benefit is the networking. So on the app service, I have to configure networking on every single Logic app, which is a real pain. It's great if you've got control over the network to automate that, but if you don't, it becomes really a friction point between teams. Whereas the ESC v3 is more like an ICE environment where you can configure the network and once at the host level, and then everything else just inherits it. But the big difference, drawback wise, from the ESC v3 is you don't get that burst scaling like you would with the WS plans. So you'd really be configuring much more like a typical app service where you say, I've got one node who now I've dialed it up to two. I think that's the big difference.
Yeah. Well, that's good. We'll think about that when we create our first standard Logic apps.
Yeah. It would be interesting to find out what Wagner and Kent think about that.
It certainly would.
Yeah, I mean, my gut feel is most of the projects I've looked at, I would probably be looking at ESC v3 first, and only the other one if you need the burst scale. Be my gut feel. So I think your next question was is Visual Studio Code all you need to move a consumption to standard and then maintain it? Do you need Visual Studio for anything? So what were you thinking on that question, Mark?
Well, at the moment, in fact, for a long time now, I've hardly opened up Visual Studio. I just use Visual. I just use VS Code virtually for everything. I'll occasionally spin it up just to if I'm actually fiddling with some Xer functions. But apart from that, I find no reason to go and use Visual Studio at all. So interested to know whether if I shifted to standard, whether I'd have to start trying to. Well, in fact, I'm not even. I think Visual Studio Code wasn't there in the list for standard. I think from remember, it's one of the IDEs.
I might have a bug in the slide then if that was the case. So
Okay, all right.
Anyway, standard's only the
so I suppose the question is, can I just continue using Visual Studio Code, or do I actually have to start using Visual Studio again?
No, I don't think you need to use normal Visual Studio at all. And I think if you were migrating a consumption, well, I think the tool that Wagner's been built and the ICE migration tool, I think, can also do a consumption logic app, if I remember right, and that would actually kind of scaffold out some of it for you.
Yep. And then the next question is, I looked at your sort of was it low, medium, and high load models, and I went through all our consumption logic apps to see where they fitted in. I suppose what was surprising is only 22 of them didn't fit the low model.
Yeah.
So
what was it? Consumption was only 22.
Well, yeah. So based on that, at the moment, I'm not going to move any of them to standard.
Yeah.
Until we get something that's a high low. But that's I suppose what I'm saying. Does that sort of make sense?
I think there's a couple of things with that. So we had a similar. So we've got 500 ICE logic apps on one project, and we've been moving them as part of an ICE migration because of the integration service environment deprecation. When I did the analysis, I think we had out of the 500, there was about 20 of them spent about 95% of the money we would spend. So we decided that's where we went like a joined model. So moving a lot of them to consumption was lower risk because it's been out there for ages, and it didn't need any of the features that are only available on standard. So we wanted to focus our high cost ones to be on standard, and I think doing that would give us doing it that way meant we would only need one logic app standard plan, probably only with one node, maybe occasionally burst into two. And I think overall our costs would be a lot lower. Whereas I think if we ended up needing two plans where one of them wasn't really doing anything, we're wasting a lot of money for stuff that doesn't really give us great value. So, but I think there's a couple of other factors than cost come into that as well. So one of the things a lot of people have asked about was, and I had a chat with Wagner about this because I think it's an important question about, right, if I bet on consumption, how much is a safe bet that is that, because you're not really doing a lot with consumption. And I think Wagner was very much of the opinion that they had a lot of work to do to support BizTalk migration customers on standard, and they've only got a finite amount of resource on the team, so that's why their focus was on standard. But also consumption just does a job. It's been there for ages. Under the hood, Power Automate's running on it. People are using it for, if you think of like use cases as well, there's like hundreds and hundreds, thousands of people using logic apps for scenarios where paying for a logic app standard plan just wouldn't make sense. So you would lose all those customers if you didn't have consumption. So consumption, I think, is a safe bet. It's just a question of, at some future point, they'll probably start doing more enhancements in it because standard will reach maturity. It's a maturity question, isn't it? Logic app consumption's
Yeah.
mature, been around for years, does a job. There's a few things we'd like, but people are delivering projects on it. Logic app standards needed a lot of maturity improvements, and I think for us that was where risk comes into it as well. So if I can migrate 450 plus of my logic apps to consumption, which are low risk, easy to understand, we don't really need to change a lot, then that's a win. And I can refactor and rewrite the ones that I want to put to standard to get better value for money out of them. And I think that's what most people should be doing.
No, we're very pleased with consumption logic apps. Back when I started our migration, I had some doubts, but none of those doubts have ever surfaced, and they just run. I think we don't have to feed or water them. I mean, I go back to the BizTalk days where I used to say to people, you can't just run a BizTalk server and leave it. You've got to feed and water it. But with logic apps, I suppose you still have to keep a bit of an eye on it. But generally, they're just things, once they're deployed, they just run.
I think, in my experience, Mark, I think the thing with it's not specific to consumption or standard. I'm sure it'll be both. I think it's when people understand how to use the Azure Integration Services platform as a tool,
the whole platform,
and join the best tools together to solve the problem. It works really well, and I think the worst scenarios are when people see, I know how to use a logic app, so I'll do everything in the logic app, and you end up with a logic app that's so overly complicated that you can't manage it. And then it just becomes a problem, and that's the worst mistake I see people do.
I get very suspicious of, it's even back in the BizTalk days with orchestrations, but with logic apps, I get suspicious if it doesn't sort of fit on one page. I begin to worry and think we should be breaking this up.
And I mean that there might be some cases where for performance reasons you might want to make it like less logically broken down, because logically broken down is easier to maintain, but then there's a performance overhead for doing it. But if you need to trade that off, then do it by exception, not by default. And also,
we have actually got some that are quite big, but that for exactly that reason, it's easier to handle.
But you can do certain things in functions that you can just call from a logic app that can take 90% of the complexity out of a logic app and stuff sometimes. So what was the next question? Would this be a good candidate for logic app standard if we had a consumption logic app costing $100 a month? So processes a 500 meg production catalog.
Actually, I think I got the number slightly wrong. I think it's probably 250 meg.
It says about 200 a day. We must plan for retries. So I think there's a couple of things here. So for me, I haven't quite figured out exactly what the cost barrier is, but we, as a general rule, we thought any logic app costing less than $20 a month, we wouldn't even think about standard. Anything costing more than that, we would think about it. And I think this one here probably would be maybe enough. Certainly, if it was just that one on its own and there wasn't anything else, I probably wouldn't do it on standard. But if you knew you probably would have other interfaces on standard, it might make sense. Now, one of the things that's interesting in your scenario there is $100 a month per environment. So if you only had that one, let's for argument's sake say logic app standard plan is going to be, let's just say for argument's sake, $800 a month. You're going to have to share that plan to make between environments to make it not cost more, but that might actually give you more problems because you're then sharing a host between environments, which can complicate your DevOps. So I think in this case, it would be more of a strategic question for me about what else are you going to be doing other than just this one logic app. I I think you mentioned it in a later question actually about turning stuff off,
Yeah.
particularly in non-prod, which I think will be.
Perhaps we can jump to that question because it sort of fits. So
Yeah.
the way we work is to reduce our costs in non-production environments. We sort of have a switch where we disable our logic apps in our dev and UAT environments, and we just sort of turn them off as much as possible to save costs. I'm not sure how you would do that in standard, because I think if you turn off I'm only talking about logic apps here, but we do it with a lot of the resources, and it does actually make a difference.
Yeah.
So how would standard work? Could you do the same thing?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is on consumption. I think there are some good cost savings. I mean, if you're aggressively polling a service bus queue, you can be looking at like $5 a month maybe, and just to poll that queue constantly. So if you can turn off non-prod, you can save that per queue that you're polling. You know what I mean? So there's definitely some good cost savings potentially. With standard, it's different. So there's two cost elements. Number one's the cost of the host itself. So that's kind of a fixed cost that you don't really pay. You know, if you stop your workflow, you're still paying it anyway. The variable cost would be for any cloud connectors. So if you're using a built-in service bus connector, you wouldn't really pay extra for the logic app side, but you would pay the transaction cost for service bus. But let's assume that cost is going to be pitiful anyway, especially if it's not really doing anything. So I don't think you'd really worry too much about the service bus cost side of that. But if you, I guess, with the logic apps on, I mean, let's say if it was a cloud connector, so you've got different choices. You can turn off individual workflows. You would have to do it via the API, I think, the management API. You can turn the app off as well.
So you can turn off the app or workflow to
both,
and that actually saves you money.
No, well, it'll save you the cost of the polling trigger if it's a cloud connector trigger.
But not because you've still got the fixed cost of the host, haven't you?
You'd still have the host cost. Now, I think there's a really interesting thing Kent shared yesterday. So Kent published a survey on LinkedIn where people can go and give feedback on support for containerized logic app standard. Now, I think the use cases they were talking about in the survey and in the LinkedIn post was about AKS, container apps, and then other container options if you roll your own container, I guess. Now, what's interesting to me is if you've got it on AKS and you've got it on container apps, does that give you the scale to zero option? Because that's really what we have in consumption. You don't pay anything when it's not being used. You don't have that with standard on ASC3 or WS3. You're always paying a fixed monthly cost. Now, you know, on the one hand, that might be really good for some people because you've got predictable pricing, which, you know, is much harder to work out. But if you had certain apps that could scale to zero, you could save a bunch of money. That's where I think it's not unrealistic. A really big customer might have let's say, spitballing ideas. It might be that you have an ASCV3 for some logic apps, you have consumption for some, and then you have some standard logic apps you deploy into a container app just to have that scale to zero. I think that it's nice to have more options, isn't it?
Very nice. Okay, yeah. So I think I understand that difference. Yeah. In fact,
just as a heads up, Mark, we're going to. So obviously, our advice, Saravana, on product ideas for serverless 360. So one of the things we're looking at doing is we do a bunch of like optimizations of different resource types in Azure. So we've been doing some work on that, especially that non-production scenario of kind of scale down and turn off and that kind of thing. We've been looking at doing support for logic apps to be able to disable them at certain times. So maybe like disable them at midnight in UAT and turn them back on at 9 a.m. or something like that. Because I think that there's some good savings there potentially.
Yeah, that would be quite good in our UAT environment, because we just don't know when people are using it to look at things.
Yeah. So I think, just in the interest of time, Mark, should we cherry pick maybe one or two questions?
Yeah, I'd like to talk about the one that I brought up with. Well, there's two. The one is about in your decision tree, you suggest that you would use standard when migrating from BizTalk. And as you know, I've been through that process, and I migrated everything to custom. Sorry, to consumption. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in that decision tree you suggested that it was better for BizTalk customers standard because they could run inline code, and BizTalk has a lot of inline code in it, and I agree with that. BizTalk developers are quite good at creating helper assemblies or custom functoids or whatever to run particular code. But I found in my case that most of the inline code, it was better to just replace with other logic. I mean, I discovered huge assemblies that were running, 10,000 lines of code. And when I looked at them, it was just because someone hadn't actually understood how BizTalk should work. And that then led to, when you try to do the move to Azure Logic apps, you should be doing that the right way rather than hiding it all in some big clump of code. So I'd like your opinion on that. I mean, I when I did migration, I virtually looked. That was the one thing I looked at, is anything that had inline code, and I basically could remove most of it by looking at the logic.
So I think there's a few angles on this one. There's always, I'm sure that's the answer I've given for every question when I rewatch the video. But I think if we need to understand the background of why they want .NET in Logic App Standard. So point one is that custom code's just one use case, but there's also other stuff. So I think things like the mapping. So the first thing is, if you're migrating from BizTalk, you've got all the maps and schemas and stuff, and that brings in the requirement for an integration account potentially for consumption.
Yeah.
One of the benefits of standards running those maps inline. And I think a lot of migration customers are wanting to do migrations where they can have a combo of lift and shift and refactor. And I think what I'd expect is a lot of customers will try and move certain stuff with minimal change, and things like those maps that call custom functoids that have .NET code in, that'll kind of help those people out. Now, I 100% agree with you. In an ideal world, I think every customer should refactor their BizTalk to leverage the cloud in the way that it would best support you, especially if it's a long-term interface. But I think in the real world, a lot of customers are just want to go make the problem go away, and do minimal amount, and then just maybe refactor certain things over a longer period. I think things like the .NET code will also support, for BizTalk, they're going to have to bring rules engine across. They're going to have to bring support for the equivalent of an expression for those migrations. So I think they're kind of what I was really getting at. But I think the other thing I think as well is, one of the things I like about inline code is I see a lot of really horrific expressions in logic apps that are, I would argue in a lot of cases, that more horrible than any inline expression shape I've ever seen.
Yeah, you've probably got a point there. Yes, I
Yeah,
did actually have to write some pretty horrible inline expressions.
I mean, I don't know if it's me, Mark, as well, but I find it really difficult to read some of the expressions when you're trying to work out what they do, especially when they reference a lot of other actions. And I know we've got inline JavaScript, which some people use as a way of kind of subverting the expressions, but I'm really like, I would much rather have. So, a lot of the time I might call out to a function to do some complicated bit of stuff, but I've got that overhead of needing a function app and having to write the code in another solution, etc., etc. And for me, if I can have that, that new Logic App workspace solution where I can have a .NET project and a Logic App project side by side, and the Logic App just sees it as a bit of code I call via an action, and then I can unit test the custom code. And I think that'll be really, I'm not for a moment. I don't doubt that people are going to abuse it and write rubbish .NET code and not test it and that kind of thing. But if you do it right, I think you could be really, you could do some really good stuff with it. And I think things like mapping, like I prefer liquid maps to XSLT. The new
I do
designer,
too.
yeah, the
Yeah,
new designer. I mean, sometimes it looks great in that, and I'm sure in the right cases where you've got a complicated map, it would be good. But actually, do you know what?
yeah,
Most .NET developers could write .NET code to do a transformation, unit
yeah.
test it, and it would be super efficient. And you can do a lot of good stuff that way. So I think it'll really help people just build better logic apps. I think is the
Yeah,
key thing.
yeah. I suppose I'm just approaching it from the from the BizTalk migration angle. I mean, we had a lot of maps which I wished we'd never ever put custom functoids in. And our solution to the custom functoids was very simply just to rip through and change them all to scripting functoids.
Yeah,
And then it just came through. We had a few .NET assemblies. I think I've sort of talked about those. But yeah, it was yeah, we had a lot of maps that we just effectively we did the same thing. We didn't want to understand the logic in those maps. I mean, some of the maps were like 10 years old or more, and
yeah,
no one knew what they were doing. So we just wanted to pick them up and use the XSLT in the Logic app, and largely that worked well. We just actually had to be careful about scripting things. So I suppose I'm sort of saying I don't necessarily agree that it's with that if you're migrating from BizTalk, you actually that standard is the good use case. I think you can do it with custom. Oh, sorry, consumption. We're sort of a bit conscious we're probably over time. Like, there was
yeah. No
one
problem.
last thing I wanted to talk about,
Yeah,
which is specific to our coming from BizTalk to Azure. One of the biggest things we had to migrate was a lot of AS2 Edifact interfaces, and one of the things that hit us quite hard when we were trying to justify it, that was that AS2 Edifact. As far as I can see, the only way you can do it is to use an integration account. So one of the things that would have been nice for us if we didn't have AS2 Edifact, we would have probably found standard quite useful in that we didn't need an integration account. So a lot of the way that we've structured our architecture is to get around the fact that we have to have an integration account. It's very expensive. Yeah, I just make the point. I think my gut feel is if anyone's using AS2 Edifact, I think they're probably going to go the consumption logic app way rather than standard, because they're using an integration account. And I just think it plays well together. I also not convinced. I suppose you might say, well, could you have an interface that's got high load with AS2 Edifact? I suppose you could, but they tend not to be. I have a feeling from all the ones we've done that they're not that intensive.
I guess I feel for me, I think like this is one of the things I was saying to Mark on email. I'd really value listening to your opinion about what you guys are doing here, because AS2 Edifact's not something I've done much with. Just even when I was BizTalk, I just never happened to get on many of those projects. But I think for me, this is where if you've got like let's say that high volume scenario, I think you can like it's how you design for best value, and I think it's possible you could have like say a receiver with your integration account that you have data coming in that can leverage the integration account and then maybe drop them into a storage account, and then you could, if you had a lot of work to do to like process that into a back end system, you might get better value for money doing the back end processing with a standard logic app, but the receiving with a consumption one. And I think that's where they're using two together. You think a little bit like in BizTalk terminology, you know, we had receive pipelines, workflows, and send pipelines, and I think for me it's a bit like that in a way, that your receive pipeline could be a consumption one, and your send pipeline could be a standard one if there was a need for it, you know. And I think that's where, you know, if like you say, there's not that many actions and you're just transforming data, it might not necessarily need standard, and consumption might be fine. And you know, I wouldn't rule out consumption at all. But I think in some cases somebody might look at their project and go, actually breaking this up and having a micro interface for the receiver, a standard one for the processing might be better for them. And I think the other thing as well would be really interesting is the strategy for integration accounts longer term, because I think they've not really touched them much for a long time.
No, you'd be dead right.
Yeah, and to be honest, I've not really seen any content from Microsoft about AS2 Edifact X12 in a long time either. So it'd be interesting to know what their plans in that space are.
As far as I'm aware, the reason why you've got to use an integration account is the sort of what I call the magic resolution of AS2 agreements and Edifact agreements. That's even in BizTalk, that was to my mind was a whole different sort of world, and that I think we used to call it party resolution in BizTalk. That works really well for the AS2 Edifact, and the same thing has been brought into the integration account. So what I like is we get a lot of invoices in, and it just picks an ID out of the invoice, and it knows which agreement to use to decode the actual Edifact message, and that I don't see how you could actually do that any other way than use the integration account. Well, I suppose I could dream up a way of doing it.
Well, you don't have to build,
but it'd be really difficult. And
I'm sure Logic App Standard has some connectors for integration account. Actually, I've not really used them, but I'd be interested to have a look and see. That might be my takeaway, is to have a look and see what you can do with it.
Yeah, I'm keeping an eye on that, and at the right point, I'm probably going to pick them up and probably do some POCs, because I'm trying to understand. I'm pretty sure you still have to have at the moment, most of the documentation I read suggests that you need an integration account as well. You can't use them without an integration account.
Interesting to see Interesting to see
I'm watching that. I'm watching that space just to see what's happening there.
Yeah, interesting after the integrate announcements about some of the new features they're working on. Like, because to me, the integration account problem's always been that the cost model wasn't really very useful for customers, and you pay quite a lot of money for questionable value. And if they had a consumption-based SKU for it, or they had a scalable SKU that offered more options, then I think it would be quite attractive, and it would just not be something people would think about much. You know, if you could base it, you know, if it was just based on the number of times you call it, then you know what I mean. It would be cost would be a problem, would it?
I agree with you. I mean, I know of many. Well, not many. It's about three people in New Zealand that have done BizTalk migrations, and they've decided that every logic app they're going to do is going to be standard. And the reason why they've done that is because they don't want to pay for an integration account to run the old XSLT maps.
Big cost saving.
Now, and that would, to my mind, be a mistake based on what you've been saying. You know, ones that are ad hoc type integrations, they're much better towards consumption. And so I think, to my mind, they've probably taken the wrong approach there.
I think it modded to the costs, isn't it? I mean, if they end up having to buy two plans, then your cost jump. There's a part in the video where I talk about the way the cost works. So it's that big jump, isn't it? Because you now need
once I saw your video, I sat there and thought to myself, well, no, that decision doesn't make sense, because probably an integration account, you know, comparable to maybe two WS3s. And if you're just doing that just to get the fact you don't have to use an integration account, then maybe you need to reevaluate your decision.
There's the other thing is there's other options as well. So I know Sandro did an Azure function mapping API, and I think, you know, to be honest, mapping is an API. You know, it's feasible. You could just put your maps in a Logic App standard, stick API management in front of it, and then you've got a generic mapping API you can call from anything. And the fact that it's a consumption or a standard behind the scenes is kind of irrelevant.
I found that quite interesting. That and in fact, in the early days, I did think of using that, doing the mapping and API management.
Well, even if
to get around
well, we do that. We do that for liquid maps, but for the other maps, your API management could just call onto another Logic App standard or something that executed a map dynamically and returned a response.
Yes. Well, it's been good to chat, Mike. I think we're probably over time.
Yeah, no problem. I really appreciate your time, Mark.
We must chat again about some other topic. It's been quite interesting, and
we should pick.
I've learned a lot from your video and from your integration playbook. And you're probably aware that we actually use quite a lot of the stuff that's in your integration playbook in our exchange.
All right, well, that's really good to hear. I always love that kind of feedback. We should maybe start a community thing where we just have a question and get a couple of people or something and chat about what each other doing.
Yeah, I'd be keen to be involved with that. You know, a round table on a particular question that's important. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, mate. I'll speak to you soon. Thank you very much for your time.
Yep. Have a good night, and I'll have a good day.
See you later, buddy. Bye.
Yep. Okay. See ya.